Living without compromise. We are to practice our faith boldly, but with wisdom, discretion, and humility. Here's Gene.
Daniel probably illustrates this principle in his life more than any other Old Testament personality. It's the story of his life. Right from the very beginning, when he was there in bondage and slavery, and when he was 15 years old, he took a bold step, but he did it with wisdom, discretion, and humility in order to win the favor of those who were in charge, to protect them even from giving him the freedom to change his diet. And so consequently, we see through his life, he's practicing this principle. And now, he's in his early 80s. There's a new king. There's a new leader. He has come through Nebuchadnezzar. He's come through leadership of Belshazzar. And now under the Medo-Persian king, Darius. And here's what we have in this unfolding story. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps. Satraps basically were governors. Now, again, this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and the major king is Cyrus, and Darius is probably, in a sense, a sub-king or a king that was appointed by Cyrus over what was the old Babylonian part of the world. You see, the Medo-Persian Empire expanded beyond what was the Babylonian Empire, though they took over the Babylonian Empire. So Darius probably is king over that particular section under the authority of King Cyrus. And so, a brilliant man. They say he was a brilliant man in terms of strategy. And so he decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators. In other words, 40 men each probably reporting to these 3. But one of these men was whom? Daniel, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. He had a system of accountability. It's really interesting that this is a major concept of centralization with unique decentralization. It was a brilliant strategy from this pagan king. Now, what happened is that Daniel had enormous success, as he usually did. God blessed him. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps, above these 2 guys who were on equal with him, plus these 120. It spread throughout the kingdom in terms of Daniel's abilities, his attitudes. We read that Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps, above the other 2, and including probably all 120 of these men, because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Boy, you can see what's going to happen. You can see the jealousy. You can see the potential of what's going to happen. And it happened. And so there was a plot against Daniel. It'd be interesting to try to recreate how all of that happened. But there was a plot. It didn't just happen overnight. The administrators, the other 2 men, and the satraps, and we don't know how many of these men, but evidently they brought in a number of these governors out of the 120, therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. And here now we have a real definition of this extraordinary spirit in Daniel. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Here he is, early 80s, still demonstrating this incredible witness in this pagan society, in this particular situation. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. In other words, we can't find any corruption in him, so we've got to come up with some kind of strategy that pits his God against our gods, and particularly King Darius. And so they come up with this plot. We read in terms of their plan. And now, let me just give you a little background. They actually went to Darius. And they said to Darius, look, and they knew he had a big ego. The fact that you're brilliant doesn't mean you don't have a big ego. And it doesn't mean you're not vulnerable. And these guys knew it. And so they said, hey, king, let's make a law, and you sign it, that if anyone bows down to any other god other than our gods and you in the next 30 days, they'll go into the lion's den. I don't know, maybe Darius was drunk when they approached him, but I know one thing, he was filled with pride. And so he signs it, which is basically a law of the Medes and the Persians. And the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which grew out of that particular culture and environment, is once a king signed something, he couldn't change his mind. And one of the reasons he couldn't change his mind was it would show that if he did, he made a mistake. And they wouldn't acknowledge they made a mistake, so they set up a law they would never change. Even though the truth showed that they were wrong, they would never change the law. If you read about that, the history of the law of the Medes and the Persians. Well, you know what happened? Here it is. Verses 10 and 11. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upper room opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day got down on his knees. Now, these men knew his practice with his God, with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He prayed, and he gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. In other words, he's not doing this to be in their face. He's just continuing to practice what he had done before, and he knew. He knew what they were trying to do to him, but he refused to compromise, even if it was 30 days. Boy, wouldn't it be easy to rationalize and say, 30 days, God will understand. I'll just back away. But he didn't. But he knew what would happen if he were taken into custody over this situation. So he continued, just as he had done before. And then these men went as a group, I don't know how many of them, and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. They just walked in on him, and they wanted witnesses so they could go before Darius and say, he violated your law. What happened was that immediately Darius saw what he had done. And there are some reasons. There are some reasons for this. Notice in Daniel 6:16, it says, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And you can add, and rescue me. Because what would happen if Cyrus, the king, found out what he had done? And at this point in time, we know from Ezra that King Cyrus had already given permission for Jews to go back to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild the city. Already Cyrus was sympathetic to the Jewish community under God's sovereign control. And here is one of his men who is getting himself into this incredible self-made trap where he has to throw Daniel, one of the guys that has the greatest reputation in the kingdom, into the den of lions. So he's threatened. He knows he's made a big, big mistake. And we see his anguish. Daniel 6:19-20. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Now, if you go back to the verses before that, It simply said that he was so agitated and he was so worried and he was so filled with anxiety, he wouldn't even allow himself to enjoy the entertainment of the night. If you know the Kings, you know what he was talking about. He couldn't sleep. He was worried. And when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. Daniel, servant of the living God. You see, he knew of Daniel's God. And when he signed that order, he knew of Daniel's God. And yet his mind was cluttered with his arrogance and his ego. Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? And of course, you know what happened. God stepped in, protected Daniel, and I'm sure Daniel had the same attitude as he had many years ago and his three friends had. If I go into the lion's den, God can protect me, but if he doesn't, I can't violate my love for my God. And so consequently, and the sad point is that Darius turns around. Yeah, he changes the law now, and he takes the families of all these men and the men who created this, and they all went into the lion's den. It's a horrible story as a result of this incredible sin and manipulation and control on the part of these jealous men who were trying to take Daniel's life. When I think of this, I think of the apostles. I think of Daniel. I think of Peter and the apostles when they're in prison in Jerusalem. And they stood before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish community, the leaders in Jerusalem, and said, in Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. They took a stand for God. I'm sure every one of the apostles knew the story of Daniel. So here's a reflection response question. How can we practice our faith without compromise and yet be as shrewd as serpents and as harmless as doves? And one of the things I want to point out here, and this is why it's so important to understand the whole biblical story. When the apostles said we must obey God rather than men, they basically they were in Jerusalem and Judah, and the Roman Empire, the larger empire, had given authority to the Sanhedrin, the 70 men that formed this Jewish council, gave them incredible power, even of life and death. And they used that power when they stoned Stephen, for example, because of the stand that Stephen took and gave his life. And when Jesus said they were to be witnesses in Jerusalem, he was saying, first of all, you are going to be within the Jewish community, men, and you are to take a stand. And Peter repeats that command, we must obey God rather than men. But here's the thing we need to understand, because we can take that statement out of context and misapply it, because as the gospel spread to the Roman Empire, out beyond Judah and Judea, it took a lot more wisdom in terms of how to live for Jesus Christ and to practice what Jesus said, to be as shrewd as serpents and as harmless as doves. And that's why the Apostle Peter, later when he wrote to people that lived within the Roman world, outside of Jerusalem, Judea, and the Jewish communities, said, I want you to show respect. I want you to live such godly lives. I want you to be honest. I want you to be men and women of integrity and be ready to answer anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that you have. What I'm simply saying is that there are situations the Scriptures cover where we need to be wise without compromise. And that takes a lot of wisdom. But God can give us that wisdom to practice what Jesus said. To be as shrewd as serpents and as harmless as doves. And yet standing above that principle, or that command, is this principle. And that is, we are to practice our faith boldly but with wisdom, discretion, and humility.